Hello, everyone. I was just going to go on to talk about democratic deficit, not just in Canada, but in any country where we have a representative democratic system. What I mean by democratic deficit is it can refer to a number of things within the representative system. It just means that the aspirations, the hopes of that system, what it hopes to achieve, are not realised in practice. So the idea of a representative democracy is that different interests, each individual is represented to some degree. No one is disfranchised. Everyone has a say, or feels that their views are taken into account within the system. No unfair advantages are conferred on particular groups. This is an important aspect of it as well, that there's no partiality given to particular groups. And all these things which politicians are so fond of talking about, openness, transparency, accountability, all of these things are present. This is what the representative system is meant to achieve. This is what it's meant to aspire to. The reality, of course, is somewhat different. Any organisation composed of human beings is going to have inequalities. It's going to have favoritism. It's going to have cronyism. We're all flawed beings, unfortunately, and when you build a whole system designed with such lofty aspirations as this, such noble aspirations of this, it almost seems like it's destined to fail. It's just bound to fail. There are bound to be problems with it in the actual execution, and I think this is true of the democratic system. I guess the overall criticism of representative democracy is that it's this idea of one person, one vote, and of some degree of political equality. Although it's not prone to gradations, I guess it's not something you can evaluate in terms of having different gradations of it. You either have equality or you don't. But there seem to be some rank inequalities within the system. Let's just think of, say, ridings, elections to particular ridings. Now, what happens if you've got a riding where you've got 20,000 voters as compared to one where you've got 30,000 voters? This is not actually uncommon. You have great variation across constituencies in terms of the actual expanse of territory and the number of voters. It's impossible to design a system whereby every constituency, every riding has the same number of voters, has the same expanse of territory. Just impossible to do it. And of course, people move around a lot, demographics change, birth rate changes, death rate changes. So populations are always shifting. So they have to redraw the boundaries of the ridings every so often to reflect these demographic changes. But what happens if you've got this kind of disparity between two ridings? Surely that then means that your vote counts for more in an election where a member is being elected on the basis of 20,000 votes as against 30,000 votes. Your vote is worth a lot more than it is in the larger constituency. Now, if you replicate that across the country and you look at the disparities by population and the number of people who are actually electing a representative, you can see just on this one small issue, maybe it's not such a small issue, but just on this particular facet of the representative system, we're falling well short of what a democratic system should mean. And one person, one vote just doesn't cut it when the number of people collectively voting is such great disparities across different areas. So that's one aspect of the democratic deficit. There are many others, of course, and in a separate talk, I want to talk about the recent election in Canada, which highlighted some of these areas. Now, one area in particular, and again talking about the voting system, is where you have a political party which has wide support but not necessarily deep support. So you might have support across the country, but it might not be enough to win a large number of ridings. So you might attain a large number of votes, but because of the first past the post system, you might not that might not be realised in terms of the number of seats. This has happened to many political parties in the past. The party which really suffers from it in Canada is the NDP, because they don't, certainly at the last election and in previous elections also, they get fairly steady support across the country, but they don't get the concentrated support which they need to win a large number of ridings. Now, when you do get a party which is highly concentrated and has its support concentrated in particular areas where it's able to represent large numbers of people, they tend to be overrepresented. So you get the converse situation to that of the NDP. You most often see this in regional parties. And in my native Scotland, we have the Scottish National Party, which only stands for election in Scotland and to the UK Parliament, in the elections to the UK Parliament. But by number of votes, they are vastly overrepresented in the Parliament because their support is concentrated. They win a large number of seats, but they don't. The number of votes is far less, but because their votes are concentrated, it doesn't. They don't have to. They don't have to win thousands and thousands of votes to win the seat. And we saw this in the recent election in Canada as well. The Bloc in Quebec is the party in Canada which is overrepresented for the very same reason as the Scottish Nationalists are in Scotland. Their support is concentrated, and this is ideal for the representative system we have, where parties are voted in on the first past the post system. So that in itself again creates a democratic deficit, in the sense that the system is the electoral system we have is manipulated, in a sense, is giving advantages to particular parties. Now, when we look out with the actual electoral system and look at influences upon the political system, then we again are looking at an area where you might say there's a democratic deficit. What about organisations? What about private entities? What about businesses who are interested in legislation, employing lobbyists, employing special interest agents to contact politicians to try and influence legislation? They have an influence which is not available to the individual voters, which is not available to even many advocacy groups. It's all a question of resources, of course, how much you're prepared to put into these activities. As I've said before, the political system allows this kind of influence. It's not always a bad thing. It always seems to have a little bit of an air of corruption or bribery or undue influence about it, but it's not always a bad thing. In many ways, these entities are educating politicians. Politicians are not experts on everything which comes before them. Very far from it, indeed. But it does seem that undue influence is brought to bear, and perhaps that's a natural consequence. You might say that's a natural reflection of the forces within a society, that particular groups are going to have greater influence because they have greater influence in the society. The representative system is only reflecting that influence at one remove. So you might look at it a bit more charitably than I have done, but certainly it's a facet, and we'll come on to that in another talk. Another aspect of this democratic deficit, of course, is that with the first past the post system, if you're a liberal in a riding which is consistently voted Conservative, then you are going to be rather depressed about your lot. You're going to continue to vote for your candidate. He's going to continue to lose. So what do? Do you just accept that as part of the electoral composition of the country? Canada has quite an unusual population distribution. The demographics of the country are a bit odd. and many people have accepted that the electoral system is a little bit imbalanced on that account. Of course, it tends to favour Ontario and Quebec as the largest provinces. No party can really win elections in Canada without at least winning one of those provinces. So that incentivizes the parties to act strategically as well. Again, which is not, it's not, I guess, in the spirit of democracy, that you're not treating each individual voter equally. You're not treating each province equally. You're micro-targeting particular areas to garner those votes, because those are essential to winning the election overall. So we have this issue not just at the level of ridings or within the electoral system, but between provinces, there's a great discrepancy as well. And the party strategy obviously is determined by where the most votes are, where the votes are which are going to bring them electoral success. That much is inevitable. But that might lead to tactical voting. If you're in a riding where your candidate's constantly being defeated, you might decide to vote for someone else as a means of trying to defeat the successful candidate. We see this quite often in situations where politics seems to be getting more fragmented, where there seems to be more divisions. You tend to get people voting against something rather than voting for something. This is usually a sign of a divided society, and we do not see too much of that in Canada at the moment, although you do see something of it in Quebec, just as you do in Scotland and in the UK. It's where the constitutional issue of the status within the sovereign territory takes precedent over every other issue, and people are willing to forget that they don't agree with a particular party on particular things, but as long as they're voting against something which they strongly oppose, then they're happy to give them their vote. So we see tactical voting going on, again, which you might consider to be a deviation from what democracy should be. Now, I still mentioned Ontario and Quebec. Of course, that situation might not continue into the future. For the foreseeable future, it will, given the population density. But it does seem that the western provinces are increasing in population. That's one of the consequences of that might be a renewed interest in that area by the political parties. They might see that the representation of those areas will have to go up, because Canada operates on the basis of a representation by population. So if the population of the western provinces goes up, over time their representation within the federal parliament will increase. So you will see something of a corrective, I guess, in the current imbalance within the system. Okay, I'm going to switch to another video.